It was much too big to be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was like a raw heap of iron. Berserk is, if nothing else, intimidating. Spanning 40 thick volumes of manga comprised of horrific acts of violence and barbarism, it might have been tricky to recommend if it wasn't quite as bloody brilliant as it is. Despite requiring a strong stomach and a significant investment of both time and money, it's an investment I cannot recommend enough. The life's work of artist Kentaro Miura, Berserk is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. 30 years spent exploring a dark, wretched, unforgiving world that has played host to some of the most surprisingly compassionate and deeply human storytelling of the last 3 decades. Although Berserk opens on a demonic sex predator getting blown to bits by a prosthetic arm cannon, and their subsequent run being packed with enough quivering lumps of flesh to make a butcher blush, the secret of Berserk is that, beneath the viscera, it's a genuinely moving story of a man struggling to stay human in an inhuman time, struggling to keep those important to him safe and close when those two seem mutually exclusive, struggling against the waves of causality itself. Our struggler is Guts, a one-eyed, one-armed swordsman who has quite literally been marked for death. Alone, pursued relentlessly by demons and hell-bent on revenge against a mysterious collection of beings known as the God Hand, the opening volumes of Berserk paint Guts' life as an endlessly bleak one. But these chapters actually sell Berserk short and fail to represent what the series is about. Because whilst Miura has filled the entire saga with beats of misery, despair, and unimaginable loss, Berserk is, at its heart, a series built on hope. When Berserk reaches the crescendo of its in media res opening, as all seems lost and hell itself threatens to drag our hero into an ever darker reality, there's a record scratch, freeze-frame moment where Guts seems to say,
"Yup, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation."
And Miura takes us back to where it all began, where the dark fantasy seems a little less dark, and Berserk cements itself as a story built on characters, not carnage. He starts fleshing out a captivating world in which Guts made his name as the Black Swordsman, from his own coffin birth to his exploits as a sword for hire, all the way to the myriad of strange locales and world-rending moments we've been privy to more recently. Miura expertly crafts a life that feels lived in. That's the benefit of telling a story over the course of 30 years. The exploration of a world, the restructuring of its own rules, the evolution of a character and the bonds they forge between the unlikeliest of allies feels earned and genuine. The members that make up Berserk's most enduring cast are some of the most fascinating, complex and ultimately human characters I've connected with in the medium. Whilst Miura revels in tormenting his cast and sending them further down a rabbit hole of eldritch horror at times, he offers them moments of beautiful tenderness, whether that be in the bonds of brotherhood between a group of mercenaries Guts joins early on, the painfully broken paternity he finds in the deeply troubled Gambino, or the love he shares with both Casca and Griffith. These three share a bond so profound, a bond built on trust and longing and the sheer magnetism of their egos, that to call it a love triangle is to do this complex relationship a great injustice. The push and pull of this conflict is the beating heart of Berserk, and it's far more electric to watch unfold than even the best of Miura's kinetic fight scenes. These beats help Berserk shrug off any notion of a perceived demographic. Whilst it may seem at first blush to be a fairly by-the-numbers seinen series, Miura has stated that he believes Berserk often shares elements commonly found in shoujo manga. You can see this subversion not only in the delicate art of Berserk's most beautiful moments, or its approach to character-driven storytelling, but also in its effort to anchor a typical power fantasy with moments of intense vulnerability. Guts isn't a typical action hero. He's traumatized and broken. His actions are often self-destructive and dangerous to those around him, and his past is full of moments that buck what we've come to expect from our leads. All of this is to say that Berserk, a series that often feels obsessed with the many, many ways the structural integrity of the human body can unravel, is a series that plays home to a phenomenally tuned balance, a balance that allows one of the most beautiful, most tenderly handled sex scenes I've seen in any media exist mere pages away from a guy's head exploding. Up until this point, it may seem like I've been eschewing the merits of Berserk's bloodletting in favour of the heartfelt storytelling underneath it all, but please, make no mistake, I'm not wishing it was tamer in the hopes that more people would pick it up. You shouldn't read Berserk despite its violent, visceral nature. Indeed, if you don't get some sort of sick kick out of the sight of a particularly heinous villain getting their bloody comeuppance, you won't get very far, regardless of how much you love the story. Berserk boasts some of the finest representations of what happens when someone throws a sword around that's bigger than they are, and the results are truly magnificent. But these depictions of ultraviolence sing because we care about the characters in the middle of it all. The best low fantasy mocks the plot armor other narratives enjoy, and the beautiful, uncompromisingly graphic nature of Berserk's world tethers its characters to the grim fates that potentially await them. In the manga's darkest moments, I flipped through the pages of a fight lightning fast to see if my favourite characters made it out in as few pieces as possible. This desperate ebb and flow lends itself to the visceral exhilaration of every fight scene, rendered with incredible momentum and perspective that stands head and shoulders above Miura's peers. This talent extends to plenty of eye-popping moments that don't actually feature any popping eyeballs. Lavish, double-page spreads of fantastical sights to behold. But it's in Berserk's filthiest moments, where his clean line art devolves into a mess of frenzied, possessed scribbling, that Miura channels a sense of kinetic rage into an action scene, and delivers bloody thrills that other comics simply cannot match. Miura's careful balancing act means that there is weight behind every swing of the Dragonslayer, not because of the sheer spectacle of it, but because we're genuinely invested in the lives that hang on its honed edge. And that is the accomplished work of a master storyteller. There simply isn't anything quite like Berserk. Berserk, being the formidable, ambitious and as yet unfinished epic that it is, has proven difficult to adapt. Many television series, movies and video games have attempted to bring Berserk to life on screen. And whilst few of them come close to what makes Berserk so special on the page, they've all been buoyed by Miura's excellent writing, confident world building and surprisingly deep characters. The 1997 anime adaptation, titled The Swordwind Romance, was the first of many attempts to tackle Berserk, and is still one of the few pieces of media that has come close to replicating Miura's savage artistry on screen. The 97 anime got a lot right. A faithful and leisurely paced take on Berserk's most popular arc, aptly titled The Golden Age, the Swordwind Romance cut very little of that 100-chapter run. It leaves out some of the manga's most unsavoury beats, but presents the rise of the Band of the Falcon, with most of its gory glory intact. Boasting a great score by Susumu Hirasawa, who would from this moment on define the music of Berserk, and a surprisingly great English voice dub, who bring a sense of levity and warmth to such a dark story. The anime nailed how Berserk should sound, but, more importantly, it knew how it should look. In a suite of maligned attempts to bring the story of Guts to life, 97's anime stands alone to many fans as the only adaptation worth its salt. This is thanks in part to a team that clearly understood the intrinsic weight and beauty of Miura's art. The series seems to take the manga as a storyboard of sorts, and sticks to it religiously. Vast stretches of its run are beat for beat, often shot for shot recreations of the source material, strengthened by a painterly, vintage colour palette, and just enough animation to breathe life into the panels these shots are representing. Despite this, something intangible is lost in the move to the screen. Not only do the limitations of serialized animation of the time rob Berserk of a lot of its momentum and impact, but important moments often fail to land as they should. These missteps will likely go unnoticed by uninitiated viewers, however, and indeed, the pacing of the show seems to confirm that it is for newcomers more than it is for readers already invested in Miura's bloody world. Fans familiar with the manga might find some of the Swordwind romance a little long in the tooth. Its midsection in particular feels a little bloated, with plenty of episodes stretching moments of silence to fill the runtime. Instead, it's a great entry point to the world of Berserk for those uninterested in reading stacks of manga, though these non-believers might find themselves swayed once the curtains close on the 25-episode series. It's a finale that leaves any viewer desperate to find out what happens next to the main players left in the lurch. And for a long time, this natural nudge into picking up the manga was a viewer's only option, and it's undoubtedly a reason that this first adaptation is, for the most part, a beloved one. It helped bring a lot of new readers into the fold, joining the chorus of voices bemoaning the lack of new chapters, and helped grow a community who fell for the deceptively deep charms of Berserk. It wouldn't be until 2012, 15 years after the debut of that original series, that the on-screen adventures of Guts and company would continue. In an effort to reboot Berserk's multimedia presence, Studio 4C stepped up with a new trilogy of films. Released over a decade after the TV series had concluded, the decision to take the series back to its roots and retell the Golden Age arc is an understandable one, though it's slightly disappointing for fans who were eager to see more of Guts' story brought to life. But in condensing that 9-hour epic, which itself had to cut a lot of great moments from the manga, into a film series that spans half its runtime, the Golden Age arc butchers a lot of Berserk's best storytelling. Paired with direction that dwells on all the wrong beats, the films serve only to confuse newcomers and alienate existing fans. Considering the arc is about the slow evolution of its characters and their relationship with one another, to rush over narrative development in favour of yet another big battle, or an extended ballroom sequence with the stinger removed, seems at odds with the intent of the source material. That said, the Golden Age films are decent enough. Their true strength comes in adapting something that the 97 series struggled with: the motion and physicality of Berserk. At first blush, the aesthetic of the production leaves a lot to be desired. The first movie is full of awkward scenes where the 2D animation refuses to mesh with the team's penchant for 3D visuals. But over the course of the trilogy, you can see 4C begin to master this mashup. Their techniques are reined in and refined, and the marriage between old and new feels a lot more comfortable by the trilogy's close, resulting in some truly spectacular sights. It's hard to deny that 4C failed to capture Berserk's narrative weight here. But whilst Miura's work is an incredibly written one, it's also a visual masterpiece. His is a series full of iconic moments, instantly recognisable visual touchstones that speak to the culmination of narrative threads or emotional crescendos. Bringing life to these moments is where the film trilogy shines, brighter than most of Berserk's adaptations, and whilst it doesn't quite make up for its own shortcomings, it certainly helps honour some of the series' best beats, especially with the newfound brutality their cinematic releases afforded. Much more faithful to Miura's original work when it comes to bloodshed, The Golden Age trilogy had me wincing and gritting my teeth, and this is what interacting with Berserk's darkest moments should elicit. It's in this way that the trilogy provides a strange alternative to 97's original run. It succeeds where that production stumbled, and vice versa. Fan edits such as Berserk Redux have spliced the two together, and thanks to the consistency of the voice actors, it works well in telling a cohesive story, especially considering even the bloopers of these original projects carried on from one another, despite the 15-year gap.
303, 798,304, 798,308, 798,309, 798,300 and leaf!
But honestly, I recommend checking them both out in their entirety. Whilst neither telling is perfect, together they achieve a sense of justice for one of Berserk's best arcs. As the trilogy ends, it reminds us that this is only the beginning. Both adaptations barely scratched the surface of the larger story Berserk has been telling for 30 years. The Golden Age arc promised more to come, and a few years later, for better or worse, we got exactly that. Known in the community as Berserk 2016 and 2017, this two-season computer-animated production picked up where the Golden Age trilogy of films left off, finally giving fans a look at Berserk's later arcs and the wonderful characters that make up this more modern run. As 4C had turned their animation style around and landed on what was a pretty great aesthetic by the trilogy's close, proving that 3D visuals could be a decent fit for the series, it was frustrating to see that good work squandered, and a new studio pick up the license to essentially start from scratch. 16 and 17 aren't great.
That news is old.
They're at times woefully ugly, full of sickening, erratic displays of poor direction. The camera refuses to sit still, presumably to hide the series' litany of sins. But even with its nauseating penchant for panning, it can't cover up some of the lazy animation on display. But the series' biggest crime is that there's a genuinely decent show underneath it all. The production isn't a complete failure, and for the most part, it's a faithful adaptation of stories that hadn't been offered this kind of exposure before, including the realization of my single favourite panel from the manga.
Thanks again, Death, for everything you've done. Farewell!
Besides this, there are plenty of key moments brought to wonderful life. There's some great music and stellar voice acting, and the episode-to-episode narrative is strengthened as always by Miura's core story. Once you get past just how uneven 2016 and 17 are, they can provide genuinely engaging television. But ultimately, they are too erratic, too messy and too ugly to forgive. They're hampered at every turn by shockingly bad decisions, from bizarre editing to some truly awful sound mixing, including a sword that clangs every time it comes into contact with anything, be that iron, flesh, or even a spirit. Simply put, Berserk deserves better than this. The fact that I found things to like in this adaptation speaks perhaps less to the redemptive nature of the show, and more to the quality of Miura's source material above all else. It's for this reason that, despite enjoying some of it, I can't in good conscience recommend it, not when it's based off a masterpiece that you can go and read in its place. Some have called Berserk unadaptable, but looking at the successes, and even the failures of these previous attempts, I can't help but think it's a perfectly apt series to translate into other media. I think the latest series might have scared off any potential studios at giving it a shot anytime soon. And besides, Anime seems less inclined than its Western counterparts to reboot a floundering adaptation from the ground up. Instead, we'll likely have to wait for Miura to write enough additional material for a gutsy studio to take a crack at a series now filthy with bad blood. But when that as yet unnamed studio steps up to the plate, I'll still be cautiously optimistic for what they come up with. Berserk isn't impossible to adapt, quite the opposite in fact. It's ripe for a spectacular movie or TV show to do some of its wonderful storytelling and eye-watering beauty justice, and the existing attempts have all partially succeeded in capturing what makes Berserk special. Some far more competently than others. We're just waiting for the stars to align, and for all the pieces of a perfect adaptation to fall into place. Let's just hope it doesn't take 216 years to get one. As you might expect from a series that spawned 40 volumes of manga, 3 seasons of anime and 3 movies, Berserk is popular. Its lasting legacy can be seen in a lot of places, and the sprawling medium of video games is no exception. From the numerous references found in Hidetaka Miyazaki's Soulsborne series, to the licensed tie-in of Dragon's Dogma, there's no shortage of nods to Guts' adventures in the gaming world. Outside of these tributes, however, Berserk has some games all of its own. Much like the anime, these are troubled and imperfect adaptations, but each of them are redeemed somewhat, often by the developer's clear love for the source material, and some interesting hooks of their own, and fans of the series will find plenty to enjoy if they're willing to grit their teeth and look past a few blemishes. Sword of the Berserk, Guts Rage, is a curious game. Released 2 decades ago in the winter of 1999, it stands out as a clunky hack-and-slash game, on a system that was ill-equipped to deal with them, and in an era where the genre was just about to blow up, and receive some far better titles in the process. As such, it has aged poorly in terms of its gameplay, but in most other regards I'm enamoured to this day with what Sword of the Berserk achieved. Like many of the adaptations I've spoken about thus far, Guts Rage just gets its source material, and it doesn't coddle players who aren't already invested in the epic storylines Miura had by this point established. This was a game primarily for fans, but it was still compelling enough to draw newcomers in. Indeed, I was one of those newcomers. My first ever taste of Berserk was thanks to this game, a confusing middle act in a story I desperately wanted to know more about. It caused me to rush off and buy Volume 1 of the manga, and start 20 years of my own devotion. And if that isn't a sign of a successful tie-in, I don't know what is. Taking place in an interesting blind spot of the manga, Sword of the Berserk is as close to canon as video game spin-offs tend to get. With its concept art and scenario designed by Miura himself, the characters, demons and grim developments feel genuine and true to the dark tone of Berserk. Children are turned into monsters and cut down without hesitation by Guts. Bad endings and depressing story beats stand out atypically compared to traditional game development of the time, and there's a huge focus on storytelling over gameplay. The title itself is easily dispatched in about 3 hours, with the majority of that runtime dedicated to cinematics, detailing a chapter of Guts' life that would have been just as compelling on the page as it is in the once impressive cutscenes of the game. With Sword of the Berserk, developer Ukes proved 2 things. One of those was, unfortunately, that they aren't particularly good developers. This was a team that locked a man wielding a sword bigger than himself into corridor combat scenes and added hit detection to the walls, after all. But the second, and the more important point, was that this was a team of die-hard Berserk fans, who not only understood Berserk, but loved it as much as we do. They knew what made it special, and they worked hard to fit everything a fan would want to see in a Berserk game, everything they wanted to see in a Berserk game, into it. Cameos from the Skeleton Knight, epic duels with Nosferatu Zod, and the reveal of a new Bayolet all elicited the appropriate gasps and cheers from myself when I was capturing this footage and playing the game for the first time in 2 decades, now with the knowledge necessary to truly enjoy its narrative. It was probably this dedication and outright fandom that secured Ukes the license for their follow-up on the PlayStation 2. and they weren't going to make the same mistake twice. The Dragonslayer could clip through walls. Chapter of the Holy Demon War, or simply Berserk PS2, was an interesting step for Yuke's. Boasting the same passion they displayed with Sword of the Berserk, this new title was, in almost every way, a vast improvement on what had come before. Taking place directly after the events of its predecessor, the only real sacrifice here is that the original story that propped up that game is absent, and instead the title rejoins Berserk canon and makes a pretty faithful go of adapting the arc of its namesake, the Holy Demon War, covering about 6 volumes of the manga. The story is told sparsely but effectively, dropping those overbearing cutscenes to focus on gameplay instead, and it makes for a great way to relive some of Berserk's more modern moments. The game's expansive levels are easy to get lost in as you freely roam about them, with much slicker combat to take on the hordes of monsters that constantly assault you. The endless respawns of fodder gets a little obnoxious at times, but the satisfying new combos and counters at the heart of the game's new systems make up for it, giving us a playable Guts that feels just as wily and cunning as his manga incarnation. No matter the odds, there are always options in the game tucked carefully up the sleeve or the prosthetic arm of our avatar, and I loved having my back to the wall and turning the tables on a fight I was sure I would lose, especially with a well-placed cannon blast. Let me just take a moment to praise Yuke's understanding of the arm cannon. In the manga, Guts' multi-purpose prosthetic arm, a device Miyazaki seems to have paid homage to and based an entire game around in the newly released Sekiro, is a bit of a last resort. Deafeningly destructive, the amount of prickly situations this device has gotten Guts out of are refreshingly reserved but hugely important. Likewise, its video game counterpart is rarely neutered. Countered by a ludicrously long cooldown between shots, this thing packs such a satisfying punch that even bosses lose massive chunks of health to a single blow. Honestly, this might be the most telling sign that Yuke's love Berserk. They're willing to throw off the entire balance of their games just to do justice to this incredible weapon. The game's pacing can be ungainly. It relies on grinding experience a little too much for my taste, and its save system can feel a little unforgiving when you lose an hour's progress to a fight you weren't prepared for. But by its end, none of that matters. Once I got into its rhythm, I loved this game. Going up against some of the best fights in the series felt amazing. Clashing with Zod was appropriately terrifying. Taking down an ogre in the middle of a flood still felt epic today, and the appearance of Slan, Whore Princess of the Uterine Sea, is just as unnerving and brilliantly fetid as it is in the manga. Yuke's once again grasped the golden rule of Berserk, that this is a series of moments, and spotting recreations of iconic manga panels during these playable fights was icing on an already delectable cake. It's a real shame that this game never saw a localized release in the West. Not only is it an excellent piece of fan service for a series that doesn't see enough solid adaptations, it's a pretty great game in its own right. Luckily, there's a scrappy fan translation out there that allows savvy gamers a chance to experience this adventure, and I'd highly recommend any fan of Berserk seek it out. Yuke's weren't particularly good developers when they created their 2 Berserk titles, but they were, in my opinion, a great choice regardless. Passion is hugely important when it comes to adaptations, and a genuine love for your source material can cover up a myriad of sins and shortcomings. For my money, this passion is absent from the 3rd and final Berserk game, and whilst it might technically be a more accomplished video game, it's a weaker Berserk product. Berserk and the Band of the Hawk is the most recent video game adaptation of Berserk, released a couple of years ago for the PC and the PlayStation family of consoles. A spin-off of the Warriors series of hack and slash games, Band of the Hawk is what is known as a Muso title, which are characterised by large battlefields with multiple objectives and populated by squishy enemies that number in the thousands. Whilst this might seem like a natural fit for the Berserk series, which often sees Guts cut through great swaths of enemies in his campaign for vengeance, this framing struggles to adapt not only the more personal, character-driven heart of its source material, but it fails to do justice to the skill, the tenacity, and the effort Guts exerts in every battle. One of his many aliases in the manga is the 100-Man Slayer, given to him for an unbelievable accomplishment and a fight that brought Guts closer to death than almost any other. Here is a clip from that level from the Band of the Hawk, and here I am killing more than 100 enemies by pressing a single button. This dissonance extends to the entire game, and its fondness for ludicrous body counts. Whilst smacking about big groups of indistinguishable enemies and effortlessly climbing into thousands dead provides brainless fun, it misses the visceral punch the manga and many of its adaptations have afforded almost every swing of Guts' sword. It's not a bad game. Indeed, it's likely the most mechanically sound of the three, but it does come off as a little impersonal, and I found myself longing for the earnest passion and innovative adaptation developer Yuke's brought to this franchise. Also, what have they done to my precious arm cannon? Being able to play as some of the Band of the Falcon and even unlikely characters such as Zod is a real treat though, and it's nice to swing weapons other than the Dragonslayer about, if only for a spell. Covering the entirety of Berserk up to volume 32 of the manga, Band of the Hawk offers up a massive wealth of content and comfortably adapts the largest stretch of Miura's story to date. It uses extended clips of the trilogy of films as its cutscenes for as long as it can, and then continues to render its own in-engine as it outpaces that production. Every now and then, something caught my attention and redeemed the title somewhat in my eyes, including a rare on-screen adaptation of the oft-overlooked Black Swordsman arc, placed chronologically for a change, a move that helps rationalise its otherwise hopeless tone. But despite how impressively vast this scope seems on paper, playing through it feels, as with any Musou game, fairly repetitive as the hours wear on. Much like the countless identical soldiers you'll cut your way through whilst playing, this is essentially a copy-paste experience. It's been reskinned to reflect its property and boasts enough fan service for diehards to get a kick out of, but as both a game and an adaptation, it's a little flat. If you're caught up and desperate for more Berserk, Band of the Hawk is a no-brainer, but if you're new to this series, there are far better ways to interact with it. If you've been waiting for some opportune moment to begin Berserk, now might be the perfect time to do just that. With the 40th volume of manga threatening to close one of the series' longest-running narrative threads, there's a sense of resolution, though not completion, to Berserk's current run. This month also sees not only the return of new chapters of manga, but also the English release of Berserk's first novel, The Flame Dragon Knight, which promises to tell us more about one of the series' most interesting villains. But be warned, this embarrassment of riches isn't typical. To be a Berserk fan is to struggle. Miura's commitment to a single project is admirable, and his work thus far is awe-inspiring to say the least, but as time has worn on, his releases have become plagued by hiatuses that can last years. Some may have you believe that this is thanks to an obsession with an idle management video game series, but burnout and the increasingly ambitious scope of Berserk is far more likely to be the cause of the constant delays. In a recent interview with the French newspaper Le Figaro, Miura stated that the series is about 75% complete, and whilst that means it might take another 10 years or more to put a bow on this sprawling epic, you can be sure that the wait will be worth it, so long as Miura is willing to use a bayonet and sacrifice some loved ones in exchange for some extra time, should the need arise. If the last half hour hasn't given it away, I love Berserk. I think the manga is one of the finest examples of true artistry in the medium, both in its aesthetics and its storytelling, and despite its imperfect adaptations, they all come together to make up one of my favourite franchises, and one I'm always eager to see grow. Luckily, it continues to do just that, thanks in a large part to the work of a devoted community, as much as the official releases. I'm clearly not the only one that's been branded by Miura's magnum opus. Berserk has captured the attention and adoration of strugglers the world over, eager to spread the word about this deceptively heartfelt series. The absolutely stellar motion comic adaptation by Studio Taka, for instance, breathes life and momentum into Miura's art to create a truly faithful adaptation, and even finds a way to utilise the 2016 anime with awesome, impactful results.
Behind you!
Elsewhere, remixed edits of existing anime, huge libraries of coloured panels, and massive, unbelievably impressive statues show off how Berserk is just as much a product of its fans as its creator. 30 years ago, Kentaro Miura created a masterpiece, a series that is as popular and impatiently awaited today as it has ever been. So I urge anyone who hasn't already, dive in, explore its violent, beautiful and breathtaking world, fall in love with characters that may or may not have done anything wrong. Look past the waves of mutilation and find out that Berserk is so much more than blood and guts. As always, thanks for watching. This was, without a doubt, my single biggest project to date, and I want to thank everyone who pitched in with this one, including Studio Taka for allowing me to share some of their fantastic work. I've also got to give a huge shout out to Saku from the Beyond Ghibli Discord, who put in a lot of grueling hours poring over manga with me. The entire Discord ended up shaping this video, in fact, and they've all been super supportive whilst I've been slogging away. Most of all, I want to thank them and all of my subscribers for being so patient waiting for this one to come out. Berserk, more than most, deserved a long-form retrospective, and I hope that if you weren't sold on the series before, this has changed your mind. If you want to help support similar retrospectives, such as the Evangelion video that we are tantalisingly close to funding, you can head over to the Patreon and pledge $1. That will also allow you to get some sneak peeks at upcoming projects and a whole host of other goodies. Otherwise, you can always follow me on Twitter or subscribe here on YouTube to get notified about future videos. If, instead, you think I should use a Bayolet to call upon the God Hand and sacrifice my channel for something worthwhile, like a Berserk adaptation by Adi Shankar of Castlevania fame, hit the like button and causality will take care of the rest. Say it with me. I sacrifice